Breland News.
Tonight, my segments are going to talk about the Popo. So this first segment, we're going to get into a little bit of the history of the police state in your name. Actually, if I pull it up, there we go. This is the name of the book. Their End is Our Beginning, Cops, Capitalism, and Abolition, written by Brian Bean.
Mr. Bean.
We've read some of his articles before on this show. Yeah, at least one for sure. So again, if you're interested in getting the book, link is in the description. It might be an interesting read. It'll probably be something I might think of getting for myself, actually. But I think it's important to kind of talk about, because in the space we talk about the police state a lot, but we don't necessarily go for the implications of it or the history of it as to why it came to be. And especially given the segments I've done within the last few weeks, I think this is kind of not kind of a continuation of, especially when talking about the slave codes that came through in what was happening in Barbados. So this is kind of more of a continuation of that. So let's get into it, shall we? So as I said, Brian Bean wrote this, where he titles it "In Truthout, Policing has always been a tool to repress the working class. Modern policing was born out of a series of transatlantic ruling class experiments to repress radical rebellion." So Brian writes, "There's no origin story of the police without the story of the reorganization of human society by the birth, expansion, and dominance of the system of capitalism. While capitalism did not create inequality, it structured society such that new methods and tools were required to impose its uniquely unequal order with threat of and acts of violence in new ways. The police became one of those important tools, specially adapting to fit the contours of this new social order. During the early decades of capitalist development, first in England, then the United States, uprisings, rebellions, and strikes became commonplace. The participants were what elites would come to describe as the dangerous class. I mean, probably still say that now, but more of a whisper. Which included white workers, immigrants, and enslaved and freed Black people. At this point, the existing precursors to the police were attempts by the ruling class to organize and manage the urban environment. The emergence of the mob and the resistive crowd posed a massive challenge to the urban order and thus required new solutions. The hope and rebelliousness of the dangerous class grew with the promise of the American, French, and especially Haitian revolutions, which reverberated through the networks of the revolutionary Atlantic. Ruling classes found the spread of uprisings increasingly worrisome and unmanageable. Since the working class was largely employed in port cities, they were concentrated at nodal points of the Atlantic trade, connected by news and word of mouth to these revolutionary developments, zoom out please, even if they weren't personally able to participate. The revolutionary waves created a profound problem for the capitalist class. How could they maintain control over the working masses in this context of revolt and compel them to dutifully submit to exploitation?
I'm betting violence.
Sure. For about a week in June 1780, London was shaken by what some consider the most significant urban rebellion England has ever faced. Nominally instigated by progressive legislation to ease discrimination against Catholics, it detonated deep resentment against the wealthy and their fledgling carceral system. What became known as the Gordon Riots, in which two Afro-American radicals, John Glover and Benjamin Blousley, and a Black woman, Charlotte Gardner, played leadership roles, saw, day after day, workers armed with everything from rifles to frying pans, roaming the streets, openly plundering of the homes of aristocrats, looting and destroying the homes of judges and magistrates, and attacking the properties of industrialists. Newgate Prison, London's largest, and several other jails were burned to the ground, while workers freed hundreds of prisoners on a single night. The offices of the Bow Street Runners, a police precursor, were raided and their records torched. In what could be described as a near revolution, Parliament and the Bank of England almost fell to the uprising. Graffiti on the walls of the ruins of the Newgate prison proclaimed that the inmates had been released on the authority of His Majesty King Mob. A nascent abolitionist sentiment of the participation can be heard in a later courtroom testimony of one of the liberators who was asked by the judge about the cause of the riots. His reply, "There should not be a prison standing on the Morrow in London. Military encampments were built in parks, and ultimately it would take the army reoccupying the city to wrest control from King Mob, leaving 400 to 500 dead."
Hmm.
The existing systems of magistrates and constables completely failed from stem to slow the Golam riots. Subsequently, Parliament was unanimous that a new system of public order was needed to prevent any future insurrectionary occurrence that marked every property as target for appropriation by the unruly crowd. While it is too simple to see the creation of mutual police in London and elsewhere as a direct response to a single righteous act, events like the liberation of Newgate Prison instilled the ruling class experiments to manage unruly workers with a new urgency and seriousness. In England and elsewhere, the new class of the free, enslaved, and dispossessed peoples not only resisted the new order, but actively attacked it. It was directly because of the Golam riots that the first bill was introduced in Parliament for a system of police in 1785, although it failed to pass. Prince Minister William Pitt argued that a solution was needed that was more efficient, cheaper, and would provoke less alarm than resorting to the army.
Hmm.
Within the workplace and the workhouse, employers devised all manner of disciplinary regimes to keep workers in their place. Outside the factory gates, however, workers were beyond the immediate command and control of the bosses. Here, they could commiserate, air grievances, and, worst of all from the boss's point of view, discuss ways to collectively fight back. This presented a volatile situation. At the time, the only real recourse was that constables had for managing crowds was the reading of the Riot Act, a proclamation ordering dispersal that was read aloud to crowds deemed unruly or threatening to public order. Failure to comply exempted vigilantes and mobs from legal recourse when the crowd was then violently suppressed. However, this strategy proved less and less useful as the size of crowds increased with the dramatic growth of the urban proletariat. The size of the crowd could simply overwhelm the constable, as happened in 1792 in Edinburgh during protests in solidarity with the French Revolution, where sheriffs squandered up to the angry crowd, read the Riot Act, and was promptly run off by a hail of stones.
Sounds.
Yeah,
Sounds like what they did in Malay recently.
Right. Though the ruling class did its best to keep Black and white laborers divided, there were also instances where these two oppressed milieus converged and linked arms in struggle. Through the 17th and 18th centuries, multiracial rebellions in 1676 in Virginia or in 1683 in Barbados, for example, were met with legal strictures that forbade trade, running away with, and many other interactions. As Ben Brucato has written, the goal of such restrictions was to encourage the growing division between white and Black worker. In New York City in 1712 and in 1741, attempts at insurrection and revolutionary arson were organized together by enslaved Africans, Irish immigrant dock workers, and poor whites, which almost burnt the city to the ground.
Yeah, the poor.
Especially in right.
Yeah,
the working
class.
Working poor. Yeah.
Right.
Especially in the port cities, such cooperation made it hard to police these dangerous insurrectionary connections and tore into historian era Berlin. Overall, 70% of American cities with a population over 20,000 saw a major disorder in the first half of the 19th century, and the threat of slave rebellion haunted the slaveocracy in the South. London experienced major riots almost every year of the second decade of the 19th century, and revolt was openly feared by those in power. Between 1825 and 1830, New York City saw riots once a month. In Paris, food riots were commonplace in the latter half of the 18th century, but the commissaries were notably absent when they happened. One customer reported that if he left his home, he would be assailed and plundered by the crazed populace. In 1775, the Flower Wars, riots of Gordon-level explosiveness, rocked Paris. Only one brave or stupid commissaire attempted to quell them, but he quickly found himself impotent to stop them and ended up being forced by the crowd to help disperse bread at the price set by the rioters. Historian Eric Hobsbawm writes that these unruly expressions of the crowds, looting, and machine breaking were a traditional and established part of the industrial conflict in the early stages of the factory and mine, in which he calls collective bargaining by riot. This political situation was described by a conventional police historian who bemoaned the fact that...
Come on, there it goes.
It was not difficult for political extremists to secure the following of a mob, incite them to rise, and lead them in a march upon Parliament. Mobs which marched on Parliament usually carried some grievances, real or imagined, which they hoped Parliament would redress. It was not unusual that mobs were unruly, destructive, and bore little regard for the well-being of local residences and their property. This relative ease of resistance, even if it was not able to culminate in victory for the underclasses, stoked the fear and contempt of the ruling classes. So let's stop here for a second.
Okay.
You didn't read this part, so any thoughts so far?
I mean, sounds very, very familiar.
That a riot is the language of the unheard.
I mean, tale as old as time at this point. Oh, the poor who don't, they're literal barren overlords are starving them, keeping them from basic rights. What do? They find sticks, stones, and rifles to push back because that's the only thing that these rich fuckers listen to. That's the language they understand.
It's interesting because I don't think we necessarily think of protests or riots back then as multicultural, which they were.
Yeah.
So I think I think that's the one thing that I don't think is talked about that much. I think you will always kind of hear Black people did one thing, and then maybe another oppressed group did another thing, and then whatever. But you never hear of a multicultural coalition coming together, if at all. At least in kind of what we might hear, that now granted it was easier in the cities where there would be kind of that mix anyway, but it did happen nonetheless. Yeah. So I think it does kind of show that if you can find common ground among certain topics or issues, that it is possible to unite and stand your ground against.
I don't even think it was that hard for them. It was like, by necessity, you all have the same goal, right? Like it's organization from the issue and the top down itself, without need of like going out and gathering the people. The people are gathered; they're the masses already. You know what I mean? Like they're stuck in the same places, in the same neighborhoods, in the same, partially due to economic systems. So like, it shouldn't be that hard. To gather in that sense, it's having the conviction, Right. So, but I sent this to you, right, the other day. This is Frederick Douglass, right? He's addressing Tremont Temple on the anniversary of John Brown's execution, which we should probably go look at John Brown and that whole scenario. But he wrote, We must, as John Brown Jr. has taught us this evening, reach the slaveholder's conscience through his fear of personal danger. We must make him feel that there is death in the air about him, that there is death in the pot before him, that there is death all around him. We must do this in some way. So, like,
right.
Even back then, you're talking, yeah, in a way that's like, their blood might have to be spilled.
And I mean, I've said this on the show many times. The only way that we're going to get policy to change is if, well, you can argue their jobs are on the line, but I don't even think, even in this case, they care. Yeah. But it's more or less do it or die. Like, those are your only two options.
Pretty much.
And politicians don't fear well, I would argue Democratic politicians don't fear their constituents. You can argue that Republican politicians do somewhat, but even then it's like they could still screw over the populace, and they're not going to necessarily worry about being bombarded by tikis and torches outside their homes, or at least it'll be very little, to the point where they can easily call the police, and then they're militarized, and then they can disperse the crowd easily, and then call it a day. But speaking of, let's get back into the article. And then, let's see how the birth of the police state actually began. If we jump back to the American South, we can see how urbanization produced similar changes to the institution of the slave patrol. Urbanization moved and consolidated the free, Black, and enslaved populations into cities, a process described by historian Julius Scott as one of the key demographic trends of the early national period. In Charleston, for example, the number of free Black inhabitants more than tripled from 1790 to 1820. This process was driven by rapid industrialization in the South that also had a tremendous impact upon the enslaved population. While field work was still predominant, enslavers began leasing out individuals for work, meaning enslaved Blacks worked more and more in the textile mills, ironworks, mines, tobacco factories, hemp factories, and tanneries of the cities.
This is
now keep in mind
Reconstruction.
That we're doing this. What's that?
This Reconstruction. Okay,
yeah.
Industrializing
keep
the
in
South.
mind, during the midst of all of this, Black people weren't paid.
Right.
So this is kind of where the idea of reparations for Black Americans, or you can argue really Black people in the West, comes in, because they transitioned from working in the fields to working in the factories without pay
pretty quickly.
So, right.
Yeah.
Freed and enslaved Black artisans and hired out, in parentheses, workers, all took part in some sort of quasi-proletarianization. The process would be a factor in the doubling of the industrial output of the South by the mid-19th century. But the urbanization of the South also brought increasing fears of revolt and required changes in the apparatus of repression. So, again, fear that the poors, or in this case, the Blacks, or the ninjas, would rise up. So, again, revolts of the enslaved, from the Stono Rebellion to the German Coast Uprising to Gabriel Prosser's rebellion to the Nat Turner Revolt, struck fear into the hearts of the slave-owning ruling class, and, as resistance from below became even more difficult to manage, the slave autocracy opted for more professionalized and reliable ways of containing it. There was great anxiety about the events in Jamaica, where in 1739, fugitive Maroon communities in the mountains united and fought a guerrilla war with the British to a standstill, winning the Maroons limited autonomy. But few things haunted the enslavers more than the example set by the Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791 and culminated in the liberation of the island's Black population giving enslaved people in the United States more confidence in rebellions. In 1796, a number of Black citizens of Charleston were executed for a large-scale plot to burn the city to the ground. They were described as having intended to make a St. Domingo business out of it. St. Domingo was the name used for Haiti at the time. Fear sparked by the success of the Haitian Revolution provoked ports from Charleston to Boston to ban, and in some places deport, Black people originating from the Caribbean.
Sound familiar.
Social controls like curfews and restrictions on movement targeted Black folks, free as well as the enslaved, but these were difficult to enforce with ad hoc bans of vigilantes. Gee, you can fast forward to 2025, not much has changed.
Tale as old as time.
While the enslavement class relied upon the cities, they also strove to keep the social space of the labor camp and the city separate, fearing that the field workers would be ruined by exposure to the cosmopolitan interconnections, a propensity to revolt of the free, Black, and proletarianized enslaved workers of the city.
That's still a thing.
Right.
That's fucking country boys, bro. Those city boys can't do baby, shut up. Like, you know, still the same shit. Like, that's you know, those liberal college kids and their yeah, okay. You know, whatever.
The hiring out system expanded the already existing networks of communication and connection between the rural and the urban. Moreover, the various legal restrictions proved unable to completely regulate city workers to the point where neither owners nor municipal officers could effectively monitor the enslaved bricklayers, carpenters, painters, and other craft workers who traveled freely around the city and surrounding countryside. It was from these craft workers that many of the ranks and leaders of major attempted revolts emerged, such as Gabriel Prosser, a blacksmith, or Denmark Vesey, a carpenter.
Which coincides to a lot of the labor violence that happened at the same time, too, I'm betting. You know?
Correct.
Like...
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was like Carnegie. I'm trying to think of the era. We're in 1820s, right? So, like... Carnegie hasn't made it there yet, but we're still talking about railroad barons and shit. So,
right,
you know,
the right-wing class in Charleston, South Carolina, a city that was 60% Black in 1820, acted on its anxieties with a more intensive and professionalized watch system than other contemporary cities in the form of the City Watch and Guard. This was especially the case on Sundays, market days, when movement and interaction were freer among both the slave and free Black majority population. It was on these days that, similar to Barbados, day patrols of musket-armed and blue uniformed squads would observe and suppress indecent or riotous behavior at the markets. In the time before the invention of the modern police, it was no coincidence that Charleston, as David Whitehouse points out, was the most heavily policed major city in the U.S. and also the only one where the majority of the people were enslaved.
Now, what's the major police city in the U.S.? In the D.C.? Like, okay.
Then, in 1822, a planned insurrection in Charleston was uncovered that confirmed the worst fears of the white slave-owning class. The conspiracy consisted of an extensive network in both the city and labor camps, where a plan to assassinate key officials, loot weapon depots, kill as many whites as possible, set fire to the city, and either escape on boats to Haiti, where revolt leader Denmark Vesey reportedly had contacts, or establish an armed outpost of freedom. Although the plan was aborted before attempted, and 35 people were hanged in response, the planned insurrection reflected the explosive potential of Black rebellion and the challenges of the city. In 1822, in direct response to the thwarting of the planned slave insurrection of Denmark Vesey and his comrades, a daytime patrol was created. By 1856, this patrol had become fully incorporated into a modern uniformed police force. The escalation in repression required the creation of a new organization with more permanent and centralized authority than the slave patrols. A Charlestonian enslaver of 1845 describes the change in a perversively matter-of-fact way. In the rural setting, the mere occasional riding about and general supervision of a patrol may be sufficient, but some more energetic and scrutinizing system is absolutely necessary in cities where, from the very denseness of population and closely contiguous settlements, there must be in need of closer and more careful circumspection.
Do you remember last week we talked about urbanization and how like police are super worried about that, which is why you see like cop cities have urban environments and all this stuff. But it was just like the use of the National Guard in that, all that shit.
Right.
You know, that this was a problem back then that they realized like, oh, cities are a problem, you know?
Right.
Like,
but it also makes sense because like I talked to you about this last night. I saw this on Twitter. You know, like I live in DC. You know, my neighborhood is gentrified, but heavily populated by a Latino presence. And to this day, you know, even a couple of days ago, I believe there was an ICE raid like 4 blocks away from my house. Like, so they're practically been swarming my neighborhood for the last 2 or 3 weeks. You know? So, but it's the idea of like, this is why you're not going to see the police in like less populated or more
like they're not out here near me where like the population is super small. They're not worried about us, you know.
Right, which will go into something that I'll definitely will talk about in an interaction that I had online with a community organizer in Chicago. We'll get more into that later. But it's the idea of like, you know, especially now with Muriel Bowser, my mayor, basically welcoming the police state. You know, like, thank you, Trump, for bringing in the police state. Now, some people argue she's trying to play 4D chess. I'm arguing like you're just kind of letting in you're just kind of opening the Pandora's box in terms of, and we'll get into this in the next segment, of, you know, the surveillance state is the evolution of what we're seeing now, into what we're reading about right now. So you're trying to bring that in, you're welcoming the police, and they're going to bring this surveillance bullshit, especially with the AI, that tech that is being implemented in many places in Minnesota. Again, we'll get into that later. That is basically Big Brother watching you every moment. So, you know, by you acknowledging or even thanking government for essentially welcoming the police state in your city or town, whatever, this is what implicitly you're also bringing in. And who's that going to affect the most? Who's that going to affect the most? People of color. So, but like I said, we'll get more into that later on in the show. But anyway, while it is somewhat simplistic to see the slave patrol as simply turning into the modern police via linear progression, there is an unbroken blue line in the history of the U.S. South, from the experiments of the slave patrol to the formation of the modern police, as the private violence of the labor camp was moved into the public city.
Yeah.
2 years before the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy, on August 16, 1819, in Manchester, England's industrial center, 100,000 workers marched in organized columns onto St. Peter's Field as part of a demonstration for suffrage and for lowering of food prices. This was the culmination of a years-long process of organizing and politicization in which the working class progressed from hunger marches to strikes, to a general union expressly forbidden by law, to political organizations fighting for radical democracy. The same year witnessed illegal unions parading in the streets, while state attempts to arrest the reformers proved inadequate when juries refused to find them guilty. Here, a raid on St. Peter's Field, King Mob now appeared as a disciplined army. The volunteer yeomen yeomanry militia was sent in first to disperse the protests and arrest one of the leaders, Henry Hunt. The yeomanry was comprised of volunteers drawn from bosses and shop owners, the equivalent of the city's business mafia, and thus its members were recognizably from the same class responsible for abuses, hoarding of grain, and driving up of prices, the very target of the workers' anger. Workers fought to stop the raid and the arrest of Hunt, carrying out a de-arrest, to use contemporary parlance. In response, the waiting English military charged the crowd and committed what became to be known as the Peterloo Massacre, in which 11 were killed and 400 injured. This act of brutal repression had the opposite effect to quelling the protests. Several nights of rioting and unrest in Manchester and surrounding towns followed, and military occupation was required to quell the resistance. This bloody event created scores of working-class martyrs and provoked an uproar and radicalization. Some sections of the movement began amassing arms in defense, training for military action, and spreading calls for revenge for Peterloo. The radical wing of the workers' movement began agitating for an insurrection against the government to occur in November 1819. Reform cannot be achieved without bloodshed, one radical publication proclaimed. Although the more conservative leadership called off the armed rising, the political mood can be seen in the report of a police informant who attended a delegate meeting representing 12,500 workers. The spy stated that workers had begun arming themselves to prepare and that there was much regret on the part of many that the insurrection had been called off. One speaker rallied, "If we had met all over England on that day, the business would have been done before now." An 1820 editorial in the London Times lamented, "Radicalism is every day most alarmingly and portentously increasing, and will, we predict, more and more, till, without change, end is certain." A relatively new urban ruling class was frightened and still determining how to control the emergence of the powerful new working class. For the ruling classes, this problem was ultimately solved via the modern police force. Of course, organized repression and violence have been used by the ruling class for as long as there have been class divisions. But modern policing is a very specific kind of repressive institution with a number of historically unique features. Some histories simplify the process of emergence and present it as it proceeding from either London or the slave patrols directly to the modern police. A closer reading of history reveals that modern cops came about as preferred tool through a process of ruling class experimentation, rooted in different repressive precursors and different institutional inertias, but nonetheless a conscientious process of mutual borrowing and shared experiences. So,
hey, you put this in.
So before we get to Malcolm, so we talked about this. Actually, we've had this discussion for the last 2 years. Like I've been home, like the last 2 summers, mostly I've been home, like traveling a little bit, but mostly working with you, on the show. You've brought up the idea of kickboxing to me frequently,
grappling,
over the last 2 years,
kickboxing, all that stuff.
And I would listen to you, but not necessarily thinking about
like,
it.
Whatever. I get it.
Basically.
I'm with you. I'm a hyper nerd about it. I understand.
But it's funny, like when I was in London a couple of months ago talking to my sister, I subconsciously said to her, like by next summer, I'm thinking maybe I'll take up kickboxing. And reflecting on that, obviously, I think it might obviously coming from you. But I think in thinking about, and we've kind of had these discussions a little bit, we don't necessarily talk, like, I'll put it this way. We talk about revolution in the space almost like in a way we talk about a love story in a novel. Like, it's just this nebulous thing that if people come together and we have the right ideas and we fight, we don't go into specifics, but somehow if we come together under like a policy or whatever and we just challenge the establishment, that the establishment will cave, we get what we want, and
fight
we live
the power.
happily ever after. Right, exactly. But
none of you motherfuckers know how to fight.
Right, but we never talk about the struggle or what that takes in order for a revolution to occur. And we've done many segments in terms of what people had to fight for and literally lost their lives in order to have the revolution that they wanted come to pass. And I don't think we talk about that enough or seriously is the idea, and we said this on the show, like, and I mentioned even like with what my father said to me just a couple months ago, there's bloodshed involved in revolution. So I'm not saying that you are going to die necessarily, but what are you willing to give up in order to have that revolution? But a part of that, as we've read in the article and what we've mentioned in several segments, is the idea of defending yourself, or the idea of being able to defend your neighbor when that event ever comes.
Yeah.
And we we played a clip of Malcolm Jamal Warner saying last week, and actually that clip is going to go up tomorrow, of how we're too comfortable for revolution. I think now, in kind of thinking about this, what he meant by comfortable, he meant lazy, because I don't think we're willing to put in the work now. And I'll get more to why I don't think
it's also the mindset.
It's a mindset. Yeah. It's a mindset, but I think this is where capitalism kind of comes into play, because
it forces you to focus on survival.
We talk about both of us talk about working out.
Yeah.
Off camera or even on camera. But for me, I have a personal trainer. I'm actually switching personal trainers probably within the next month. I have to pay for a gym membership.
Shit costs money, don't it?
I have to try and eat right. I have to eat properly, and even now that's getting expensive. And I have to put in time in order to get myself to where I
got a home gym. Some of you have seen my home gym online. You can count the dollars in that if you know what's up. A lot of money, but I guarantee you, anyone who wants to come use it, go ahead. You're welcome to. Be safe.
Right, but that's the thing. Like, capitalism, unfortunately, especially among the working class, has made it so that we're thinking about our kids. We're thinking about our bills. We're thinking about how we're going to get food on the table. We're thinking about how we're going to get to work. We're thinking about how to take care of our families. We're thinking about how we're going to take care of our basic needs. It's not to say that we're lazy, although I think it's part of it, but we're so distracted by the day-to-day because we are so squeezed because we're not getting very much relatively from the powers that be, that we're too distracted to think about revolution or anything of the sort, or to take care of ourselves in order to prepare ourselves. I was watching a podcast, not a podcast, of a fitness influencer over the weekend. And he mentioned something that I think was very interesting. He said, obviously with fitness, as I mentioned, there's time involved, there's sacrifices involved. But he made a point, like, during the pandemic, when food, even back then, 2020, food was cheaper then, but it was still expensive, and we were home, many of us, we were bored, many of us, bread was kind of expensive, but or you couldn't get any bread at that point, what were people during that time when they had a little bit more money and extra time, what were they doing? They were making sourdough bread. Somehow people, when they had time and energy and the boredom caused them to think of the possibilities that they can do. Everybody and their mother was making sourdough bread for like that year. I wasn't, but some of you were. But it just kind of shows the idea of like, if you're given a little bit of money, if you have a little bit of time, and you have the imagination to think beyond your circumstance, then you can do more of yourself. You can actually take care of yourself.
Yeah.
That you can actually make moves. And I think that right now, that's what the establishment is scared of. That's probably why, in my opinion, they're not giving you as much money. They're not giving you as much time because they don't want you to think of the possibility of what can happen if things were truly liberated for you. So they need to keep you in the space where you're going to be so distracted of not paying you well enough, not working you to the bone, and making you so distracted that you can barely think about how I'm going to get through the next hour, more or less the next week or month or year, that you're not thinking in terms of organizing or even yet, and we've had this discussion, like, if the revolution is going to come, how are you going to fucking defend yourself? Like, and I want to preface by saying that doesn't mean to buy a gun, because some of you don't need that kind of power.
Yeah.
But it could mean,
plus,
like,
these things don't save you. Like, a lot of other shit. You need a lot more shit on top of that. Like,
what are you preparing?
What do you mean
for that? Just
I've just got it fucking down here all the time. You know what I mean? So
right, but even with that, like, I was watching another podcast maybe last week with two women, and one of the women said that a former boyfriend of hers, like, had her learn to, take her to the gun range or whatever, and he basically told her, like, if you ever have to pick up a gun, you're using it. Yep. Meaning, one, it's a last resort, and if you pick it up, you have the intent. You have the intention to.
Yeah, they're not just intimidation tools. Like,
no,
I've seen that go wrong 1,000 times.
Right.
I just like learn how to fight first and foremost, if you can and are able. You know, I think about this. We've talked about this too, where it's just like we just got to start thinking tactically. You know, like, because look, the powers that be can escalate about 80 times more violently than you can, right? That doesn't mean you aren't prepared for the level of violence they're going to bring. You definitely should. But, like, you know, there's a lot of stuff that back then you could get away with. Now, the ways you can organize and the ways you can do stuff, they aren't letting you do anymore. So,
well,
you're going to have to find ways around that.
Well, even back in the civil rights movement, there was infiltration. Now,
granted, for sure,
you know, it's definitely gotten a lot more sophisticated now.
Yeah.
Again, we're going to talk about that a little bit. Well, we've talked about it before, but we're going to talk about it in my next segment later in the show.
Yeah.
Just to give you an example of that. But, you know, I think, but I still think, well, that, I mean, you've kind of mentioned this, that any talks of revolution or anything of organizing should not be done online, bare minimum, because you don't want the surveillance state to even know about it. And this is the thing that we see in history, as you've also said, like, a resurrection will pop off at any second.
Yeah.
So it was the idea back then of, like, stay ready. You know, so that's what I mean in terms of taking care of yourself, you know, doing the very things like that you need to do, like, or even for me, as I said, like, even if you working out to run away from the cops,
right?
You know, that's a form of resistance.
And, like,
you know, like
compliant resistance, that's a thing too. Like, keeping yourself safe if cops grab you, like, plenty of stuff that is just survival.
Right. I showed footage of me when I ran into that ice raid. What were people doing? Yelling, screaming, videoing the ICE agents, basically saying, "Get the fuck out."
Well, an anti-riot tactics is a thing you should be looking up as well, right? How are you going to deal with tear gas when it's thrown at you? How are you going to deal with shield walls of cops? How are you going to deal with kettling? How are you going to deal with... There's ways. People are inventive, but that needs to be figured out now. And you need to have that knowledge now. So,
but I think it's a lot easier to have these conversations now with Trump.
Yeah.
But I think the challenge is, as I said, stay ready. You know, even under a Democratic governor or mayor or president, you still need to have these, like, you know, these tactics in play, because in the event that something pops off, regardless of whoever is in charge, you need to be ready. And I think, and I honestly don't think even in this space we talk about that enough or well enough for people to have that idea of like, oh, I need to do this other bit in terms of my body right, my mind right. So, and it's not just about like mental health. Well, it's part of it, but it's the idea of like, what are you going to do in the event, like if something like that happens to you, how are you going to respond? Or if you catch someone trying to infiltrate like a neighbor or something, what are you going to do in order to help your neighbor? You know, like we need to be looking out for each other in that way and for ourselves. And I think we need to figure out what kind of time and commitment that we need to do in order to ensure our livelihoods here. Because especially if we're going to talk about revolution, like, again, our government leaders have several steps ahead of us because they militarize the police, and we are so distracted and we're lazy in terms of our physical and mental state that they will knock us out in a second. So we need to start thinking a little bit beyond of what they are.
Yeah.
And I think someone in the chat said, we need to have these conversations offline.
And know your enemy too, by the way. Like, you're not going to be able to beat them if you don't know the tactics they're taught. Go look up warrior training for cops. Go look up their riot control stuff. Like, that information's out there, you know? You can freely find it. So please go do that. But
we've talked about, I think this is definitely, we talked about doing this or talking more about like resistance in terms of like you know, whether it is like kickboxing or like, you know, whatever. We talked about doing that segment, but like obviously we don't want to do it half-ass. Like I think there's definitely like a lane where we're kind of educating our audiences, or at least sharing the information that we get in terms of how to protect yourself, how to ensure your safety and the safety of others in the event. And I think especially right now, I think it's definitely more pertinent. But again, the idea is staying ready, because you never know when, if and when the revolution ever arises in this country. And as I said, I don't believe this revolution is ever going to come anytime soon. That being said, I think to have that kind of insurance of being ready if that time ever comes, I think is very important. And I think that's something that,
especially when you want to think about like, not everyone will be. And if you're wanting to be, you know, like, not everyone's capable either. And it's going to be your responsibility to help those.
Well,
you know?
Well, even with that, and again, I want to preface, it doesn't always mean like physical violence or physical assault or whatever you want to call it. It could be, you know, like medics, like learning basic first aid. It could be being a citizen journalist. Like your phone is a powerful weapon these days.
Absolutely.
As you know, so we need people of different walks of life doing different things within the resistance. So, you know, mutual aid, it's definitely a part of that. But I think we kind of limit ourselves to thinking just that in terms of resistance. Like, there's a lot more nuance to resistance than just mutual aid. So, again, not to knock on our colleagues who are promoting that, but we also need to think of the other avenues that we need in order to protect ourselves and each other, which can include and should include perhaps arming yourself or taking care of yourself in terms of some type of martial art or something of that vein in order for you to truly resist the armed forces if you get to that. So going off of that, let's watch this clip from Malcolm to end this, where he talks about self-defense and gun rights during the civil rights movement. So go ahead, you can play the clip.
You have called for self-defense units, rifle clubs, ready to execute on the spot those who threaten Negroes.
I don't think that I said that.
Yes, you did.
No, I don't think I said that.
All right.
I have called for rifle clubs, that I think Negroes should, in areas where the police, whether it be federal, state, or city, have proven their inability or their unwillingness to defend Negroes, the lives and the property of Negroes, then it's only intelligent and it's only right that Negroes protect themselves, and I have encouraged them to buy a rifle and a shotgun, which according to the Constitution is legal.
For what purpose?
Not buy a pistol or something like that, but a rifle or a shotgun, which is constitutionally legal.
For what purpose?
So that at any time, anyone makes any effort whatsoever to brutalize them or attack them or endanger them, they should have something to defend themselves. And in a country that spends, I think, $50 billion a year for defense alone, I'm shocked that there's apprehension over Negroes trying to do something to defend themselves.
Well, who will determine when the Negro is endangered?
I think that if the government is concerned,
the person himself,
instead of being so worried about what the Negro is going to do, the government should stop dragging its feet and take the initiative necessary to eliminate the injustices that frustrate Negroes and drive them into a method of defense such as this.
You've said, Minister Malcolm, you have to expect the Negroes to rise up sooner or later.
Oh, yes.
What does that mean?
Well, just the same thing that it meant in South Vietnam and these other places where you find oppressed people. Sooner or later, they rise up against the oppressor. When the Jews were being brutalized in Poland, there came a time when they couldn't take it anymore, and they fought back. They didn't have too much to fight with, but they fought back. And I think every oppressed people, no matter how meek and humble they are, after you drive them so far, they're going to strike back.
Right.
Yep.
I think you brought up a good point that the government doesn't have to worry about uprisings if they did what they
if they dealt with a fucking problem, the underlying issues, but they never do.
Right. So it's like we spend over $1 trillion in defense. So, just given our capability of defense, I mean, what is that kind of teaching the populace? Like, we need to defend ourselves too. But somehow that's a problem for them when we want to do it to protect ourselves from them, So, but you can also make that connection to any oppressed groups, especially right now, what's happening in Gaza, and in their way, and we've talked about this in many ways, the art of cooking has been resistance. The art of art has been resistance for them. The art of trying to report on something and then tweeting it out has been an act of resistance. So again, Malcolm was talking about in terms of arming yourself. I think you can look into that now with a lot more nuance than that. It can include that, but it doesn't mean the all end all. There are other ways of showing your resistance that doesn't necessarily involve, but we need to be aware of all of these avenues in order to protect ourselves better. But yeah, I think this is definitely worth a lane that we can kind of explore a little bit. But yeah, I think this is definitely worth a lane that we can kind of explore a little bit. Just to inform our audience a little bit more. And let us know if you're in the chat or if you watch this as a clip, let us know what you think. do you think it's necessary for you and others like you to defend yourself in case the revolution ever comes and you'll be in the position not only to defend yourself, but maybe to defend or protect other people? And what would that look like for you? Like, again, doesn't have to be an armed weapon, but what other avenues do you think that you're gifted in that you want to be able to assist in some way? Let us know in the chat or let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and please share to fight the suppression, because I'm sure YouTube is going to suppress this out of all hell, given that we're talking about this issue. And help us get to 3K. We're almost there. I think we're over 2,500 right now. We're trying to get to 3K by the end of the year, if not sooner.
Yep.
And thanks for watching.